Money is commonly described as a store of value, a neutral measure, a stable reference point across time. When that stability weakens, the reaction is immediate and emotional. We talk about mismanagement. We talk about irresponsibility. We talk about mistakes that could have been avoided. This reaction feels intuitive, but historically it is misleading. Across centuries and across radically different societies, money does not preserve value. It erodes. Slowly, persistently, and almost universally. This is not a modern phenomenon. It predates central banks. It predates paper currency. It predates industrial economies. From ancient metallic coinage to modern fiat systems, the same pattern appears again and again. Currencies begin with constraints. They operate within limits. And over time, those limits loosen. This repetition matters. If money were naturally stable, value loss would be rare and exceptional. Instead, it is the dominant outcome, which suggests that the problem is not incompetence. It is structure. Most discussions about inflation or devaluation begin with intent. Who caused it? Who benefited? Who failed to prevent it? But this framing assumes that money exists independently of the system that issues and manages it. In reality, money is not a natural object. It is an institutional instrument. It reflects the priorities, constraints, and survival needs of the system that maintains it. Once this is understood, value loss stops looking like an anomaly. It starts looking like an adjustment mechanism. Historically, systems do not optimize for the long-term purchasing power of money. They optimize for continuity. They face obligations that cannot be postponed. They face coordination problems that cannot be resolved through direct extraction alone. And they face political limits on how visibly costs can be imposed. Under these conditions, preserving the real value of money becomes secondary. What matters is functionality. Money must circulate. It must settle obligations. It must remain acceptable. And it must absorb pressure when other mechanisms reach their limits. Value erosion allows this to happen gradually, without explicit defaults, without immediate confrontation, without open collapse. This does not require deception or long-term planning. It emerges naturally when systems grow larger, more complex, and more indebted, which is why monetary stability, when it occurs, is usually temporary, and why periods of strict constraint are often followed by episodes of dilution. The goal of this video is not to argue that inflation is good or bad. It is to explain why it is normal. To do that, we need to step away from modern debates and look at money historically, as systems have always used it, not as a moral promise, but as a structural tool. When monetary systems are introduced, they almost always begin with constraint. Rules are explicit. Limits are defined. Value is anchored to something tangible or formally restricted. In early systems, this constraint was physical. Metal content defined value. Weight and purity mattered. A coin was not simply a symbol. It was material. But even under these conditions, stability did not last. Across different civilizations and eras, monetary units slowly drifted away from their original specifications. Silver content declined. Weights were adjusted. New issues circulated alongside old ones at equal face value. This was not accidental. States discovered early that strict monetary constraints limited their ability to operate. Wars required funding. Administrations required maintenance. Territories required coordination. Raising taxes was visible. Confiscation was destabilizing. Debt, when available, was finite. Monetary dilution offered an alternative. By altering the unit rather than the obligation, systems could mobilize resources without immediate confrontation. The cost was real, but delayed, and crucially, dispersed. This pattern appears repeatedly. Roman silver coinage lost the majority of its precious metal content over centuries, not decades. The unit remained recognizable. The name remained the same, but its purchasing power declined steadily. Medieval European states followed similar paths. Coins were reminted. Standards were revised. New denominations were introduced to mask old reductions. In each case, the justification was temporary necessity, exceptional circumstances, emergency measures, but the direction was consistent. What is often described as debasement was not a deviation from normal governance. It was a method of governance. Importantly, these systems did not collapse immediately. In many cases, they functioned for long periods after monetary erosion began. This tells us something critical. Monetary stability is not a prerequisite for system survival. Operational continuity is. As long as money remained acceptable for taxation and exchange, gradual value loss was tolerated, and often preferred. The same logic persisted even as monetary systems evolved. When paper instruments replaced metal, the constraint shifted from physical scarcity to institutional credibility. But the pattern remained. Convertibility promises were introduced. Limits were defined. And over time, those limits were relaxed. Gold standards were suspended, reintroduced, and suspended again. Each suspension was framed as temporary. Each reintroduction promised discipline. Yet over the long run, purchasing power continued to erode. This is not a coincidence. What history shows is that monetary systems consistently move toward arrangements that maximize flexibility. Rigid money constrains response. Flexible money absorbs shock. In periods of expansion, flexibility enables growth. In periods of stress, it prevents abrupt collapse. From the system's perspective, gradual erosion is preferable to sudden failure. This explains why monetary erosion tends to occur slowly. Rapid devaluation triggers resistance. Gradual adjustment does not. Small changes are absorbed through prices, contracts, and expectations. They do not require formal renegotiation. This makes value loss politically and socially manageable. Over time, populations adapt. Contracts adjust. New norms emerge. The original value anchor fades from relevance. At no point does this require a conscious decision to destroy money. The process emerges from repeated short-term decisions made under constraint. Each step is defensible. Each adjustment is justified. And collectively they produce long-term erosion. This historical repetition matters because it challenges the idea that stable money is the natural state. If stability were natural, erosion would require constant explanation. Instead, stability itself requires constant enforcement. It requires systems to refuse flexibility even when pressure mounts. Historically, systems rarely make that choice. Which is why, across time and geography, money tends to lose value. Not because rulers are uniquely irresponsible. Not because systems are poorly designed. But because monetary erosion is the least disruptive way for complex systems to remain functional over time. To understand why monetary value erodes so consistently, we need to reconsider what money actually represents. Money is often treated as a thing, a unit, an object with intrinsic meaning. Historically and structurally, this view is misleading. Money is not a thing. It is a claim. It represents an obligation of the system that issues and enforces it, an obligation to accept it in payment, an obligation to recognize it in settlement, an obligation to treat it as valid within a defined economic space. In early systems, this claim was reinforced through material backing. Metal content created a physical limit. But even then, acceptance depended on authority. A coin had value not because it was silver, but because institutions accepted it for taxes, fines, and contracts. As systems grew more complex, the nature of this claim evolved. States expanded administratively. Territories grew larger. Obligations multiplied. Military commitments increased. Infrastructure expanded. Bureaucracies became permanent rather than episodic. At the same time, political constraints limited direct extraction. Taxation was visible. Excessive extraction risked unrest. Direct seizure undermined legitimacy. Under these conditions, monetary expansion became an increasingly attractive adjustment mechanism. By issuing more claims, systems could meet obligations without renegotiating existing ones. The cost of adjustment was real, but indirect. Rather than confronting individuals directly, the system adjusted the unit itself. This reframing is critical. If money is a claim, then its value depends on the balance between claims and the system's capacity to honor them. As obligations grow faster than real output or extraction capacity, tension emerges. That tension must be resolved. There are only a few options. Claims can be defaulted on. Claims can be restructured explicitly. Or claims can be diluted. Historically, dilution is the least disruptive. Explicit default concentrates losses. It is visible and politically costly. Restructuring requires coordination and negotiation. It creates winners and losers. Dilution spreads adjustment across time and population. It avoids naming victims. It maintains continuity. This is why monetary erosion is persistent even in the absence of crisis. As long as systems grow and obligations expand, maintaining constant value would require constant resistance. It would require limiting claims, limiting spending, limiting response capacity. Few systems choose this path for long. This logic applies regardless of monetary form. Metallic systems faced physical limits, but political pressure encouraged gradual redefinition. Paper systems replaced physical scarcity with institutional rules. Those rules proved flexible under stress. Modern fiat systems remove formal backing altogether, but the underlying dynamic remains unchanged. Money expands to accommodate system needs. Value adjusts accordingly. This does not imply chaos. On the contrary, systems often manage this process carefully. Gradual value loss allows expectations to adjust, contracts to reprice, nominal structures to remain intact. The alternative is rigidity. Rigid money forces immediate confrontation between obligations and capacity. It exposes imbalances quickly, and it limits institutional maneuverability. From a system perspective, this is dangerous, which is why value preservation is rarely the dominant priority. The primary priority is acceptance. As long as money continues to circulate, settle obligations, and coordinate activity, gradual erosion is tolerated. This also explains why money often retains symbolic stability even as real value declines. Units remain the same. Denominations persist. Names do not change. Continuity is preserved at the surface level. The adjustment occurs beneath it. This is not deception in a moral sense. It is an institutional compromise. Money is asked to do too many things at once. It must store value, facilitate exchange, settle debts, absorb shocks. When these functions conflict, storage is usually the one that yields. Not because it is unimportant, but because it can be adjusted without immediate disruption. Seen this way, monetary erosion is not a breakdown of trust. It is the system prioritizing function over preservation. And that priority has repeated itself across centuries, technologies, and regimes. In modern discourse, inflation is often treated as a deviation from normality, a disturbance, a problem to be corrected. Targets are set. Statements are issued. Stability is presented as the objective. Historically, this framing reverses the reality. Persistent inflation is not the exception. It is the dominant outcome of monetary systems once they reach a certain scale. To understand why, we need to look at how modern economies are organized. Contemporary systems are debt-based. States issue debt to finance operations. Corporations rely on borrowing to sustain investment and valuation. Households use credit to access housing, education, and basic participation. In such a system, nominal stability becomes critical. Debts are fixed in nominal terms. They must be serviced regularly. They cannot adjust automatically to changes in real economic capacity. If money retained constant purchasing power while nominal debt expanded, the real burden of obligations would increase over time. Servicing would become more difficult. Defaults would rise. The system would contract. Inflation offsets this dynamic. By gradually reducing the real value of money, the system reduces the real weight of existing liabilities. Debts remain payable in nominal terms while their real burden adjusts downward. This is not an unintended side effect. It is a stabilizing mechanism. For governments, inflation eases fiscal pressure without explicit default. For corporations, it supports nominal revenue growth even when real growth slows. For households, it allows incomes to rise nominally while obligations remain fixed. Most importantly, inflation preserves continuity. Defaults are disruptive. They concentrate losses. They trigger visible conflict. Gradual value erosion spreads adjustment over time. It avoids clear breakpoints. It allows systems to adapt without formal rupture. This is why periods of strict price stability are historically rare and often short-lived. When inflation approaches zero for extended periods, systems begin to strain. Debt becomes harder to service. Nominal growth slows. Incentives to borrow weaken. Deflation, in particular, reverses the stabilizing logic. As prices fall, the real value of debt increases. Obligations become heavier. Consumption is postponed. Revenues decline. The system enters a contractionary loop. Historically, such conditions prompt intervention. Monetary constraints are relaxed. Liquidity is injected. Inflation is allowed to return. Not because policymakers prefer inflation in abstract terms, but because the system requires nominal flexibility to function. This explains why modern monetary regimes aim for positive inflation targets rather than absolute stability. The target is not value preservation. It is manageability. Inflation creates a buffer. It absorbs shocks. It smooths adjustments. It prevents rigid nominal structures from collapsing under real-world pressure. From this perspective, inflation is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of a system operating within its constraints. This also clarifies why public concern about inflation tends to rise only when it accelerates. Gradual erosion is tolerated. It becomes part of expectation. Sharp spikes disrupt coordination. They break assumptions. They trigger political response. The system's objective is not to eliminate inflation. It is to control its pace. Slow enough to remain socially manageable. Persistent enough to support nominal structures. This balance is difficult to maintain, but the direction is consistent. Over time, money loses value not because control was lost, but because control was exercised. Stability in such systems does not mean constancy. It means continuity. Inflation serves that continuity by aligning nominal obligations with a changing real economy. When viewed this way, the question changes again. The issue is not why inflation exists. The issue is how systems function without it. Historically, they rarely do. When viewed through a historical and structural lens, the question of monetary value changes fundamentally. Money does not lose value because systems fail. It loses value because systems adapt. Across different eras, technologies, and institutional arrangements, the same logic reappears. As obligations expand and coordination becomes more complex, monetary flexibility becomes essential. Rigid money constrains response. Flexible money absorbs pressure. From the perspective of the system, gradual value erosion is not disorder. It is a controlled adjustment. This does not require intent or conspiracy. It does not require incompetence or moral failure. It requires only scale. As societies grow larger, more interconnected, and more indebted, maintaining constant purchasing power becomes increasingly costly. Not economically, but politically and institutionally. Preserving value would require limiting claims, limiting spending, limiting response capacity during stress. Historically, systems rarely accept these limits for long. Instead, they choose arrangements where adjustment is distributed rather than concentrated. Inflation, debasement, and dilution all serve the same function across different monetary regimes. They allow systems to reconcile expanding obligations with finite extraction capacity. They preserve nominal continuity while real values shift beneath the surface. This explains why monetary stability, when it occurs, is usually temporary, and why periods of strict constraint are often followed by episodes of relaxation. It also explains why the language surrounding money remains moralized. Value loss feels like betrayal. It feels personal. But structurally, money was never designed to preserve value indefinitely. It was designed to circulate, to coordinate activity, to settle obligations, and to absorb stress when other mechanisms reached their limits. From this perspective, inflation is not an error to be corrected. It is a structural outcome of how modern systems function. Understanding this does not eliminate the consequences of value loss, but it reframes them. It shifts the focus away from individual decisions and toward institutional design. And it clarifies why debates about money often repeat without resolution. The system does not aim to eliminate erosion. It aims to manage its pace, slow enough to remain socially tolerable, persistent enough to sustain nominal structures. In that sense, money losing value over time is not an anomaly. It is the historical norm. And once that is recognized, the question is no longer why money changes. The question is what kind of system would be required for it not to.